Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells, and I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction. And I talk about games on the internet. Today, I'm going to be talking about the greatest RPG campaign ever published, which is the Great Pendragon campaign. I talked about Pendragon a while ago. It's one of my all time top three easy RPGs, probably top two. And it is a game entirely based around Arthurian role playing. Everyone plays a knight. That's the only character class that there is. And you kind of go through, and then it's designed to recreate the feel of Le Morte d'Arthur or the Once and Future King and that kind of thing. You play through the story. Now, the core book is just the rules for how to do that. The Great Pendragon campaign is the actual storyline that you play through. And this is enormous. Like, you can see how big this campaign book is. This takes you through from the start of King Uther's reign in, well, I guess it's not the start, but early in his reign in 485, the year 485, and then follows through with, the whole Sword in the Stone and the Grail Quest and Guinevere and Lancelot and Mordred and everything, and it ends with the death of Arthur and the fall of Camelot. Spoiler warning, in the year 566. That is 82 years of storyline. And the game, Pendragon, is perfectly engineered to tell this kind of story. It is designed to be a generational game where you are not playing a single character so much as you are playing a family line. You're playing a successive generations. You will play one knight and then that knight's child and then that knight's child, or maybe a brother if one of your knights doesn't live long enough to have children. And so it works really well, and it's really beautiful. Let's show you. Boink. Let's take a look at the book itself. And I'm actually just going to start with the table of contents because I think this is a really great way of showing you everything that's in the book. Because here is the entire book on one page. It is split into periods or eras of play. And you start with, and what's great about this is that each one has a very distinct flavor to it. They're not just divided up because they needed chapters. They're divided up because the feel of them is noticeably different. And so you begin with the King Uther period, which is very medieval. It's very brutal. Everything is dirty. Might makes right. And we start there on purpose narratively because that is going to set us up for the reign of Arthur and the Round Table and the idea of how chivalry is important, and you can treat people well on purpose, not just because you have to, but because you were a good person. But that's all going to come later. In Uther, there's none of that. And then Uther dies, and we get the Anarchy Period. And the Anarchy Period is fascinating because there's very little storyline. There is, but it's not a railroad of any kind. It is very open and sandboxy. Basically, Uther dies, and then we've got 10 years or so, whatever it is there, before we get, it looks like 13 years, holy cow, before the Boy King era, before the Sword and the Stone. And so we have this period in which the game just kind of sets you up with the politics and the situation and the maps and says, this is what it looks like. Survive as best you can for 13 years because Arthur is not going to show up for a while. And this was, when we played through the campaign, honestly, my group fell apart fairly early in the Anarchy Period because life always gets in the way, and this is a very long campaign. But the Anarchy Period is fascinating to play through because it is so wide open. You no longer have a lord. You no longer have a king. You just have to survive as best you can, coming up with your own plans and strategies and how you're going to talk to people. Really interesting stuff. Then you get into the Boy King because what little storyline there is in the Anarchy Period is there's this sword in the stone. Who's going to pull it out and who's going to be the king of all England? And then Arthur does. And then we support him for a few years. And that's, its own little story. And then we get to the Conquest Period. Arthur is no longer a boy. He's becoming a man. This is where the story gets into basically a big war. And whereas the Anarchy Period was completely sandbox, the Conquest Period is very heavily scripted because you are in some ways kind of playing through an analog of the 100 Years' War, and it's only going to take you 10 years, but it's there. And you go to France and you conquer and you fight and you do all this stuff. Then the Romance Period. This is kind of the really fancy Lady of Shalott. People are falling in love, and the concept of love itself is important. And so you get Lancelot showing up, and you have Guinevere, and you have all of these kind of very high ideals. It's a relatively peaceful period, and so you have time to tell, stories of proving yourself and fighting for the honor of your lady love and things like that. The Tournament Period continues some of that. This is kind of the height of Arthur's Camelot, where everything is very stratified to some extent. Everything is very stylized. You get to play through this period where, you have Lancelot and the Round Table, and people are, putting their ladies' handkerchiefs on their lances as they go joust, things like that. Tournament Period is big on that. But in the background of all of that, we're starting to get the rise of Mordred. And so there's definitely still, I don't want you to think that the Romance Period or the Tournament Period are boring, because they're absolutely not. There's still a lot of darkness seething under the surface. Then the Grail Quest. The Grail Quest is very interesting because it's very short, the Grail Quest period. And also, that beginning of the chapter, let's just show you this because I love it and I find it delightful. It says here, where is it? We don't expect the player knights to obtain the Holy Grail. Most player characters just don't have an interest in playing the total goody-goody that is necessary to succeed. And I love that. That's one of the things that, comes kind of part and parcel with playing through the Pendragon campaign, is that to some extent you already know everything that's going to happen, right? And you are not the main character in it. This is Arthur's story. And Guinevere and Lancelot and Galahad and Gawain and Bors and Ector and all of those people are there. And you are in the background. And so there's the Grail Quest is happening, and Galahad is going to be the one that does the thing, but you are still a part of it. Think of it in some ways analogous to the Saxon Chronicles by Bernard Cornwell, or the Last Kingdom TV show on BBC, if you're more familiar with that. It's a different time period, it's a totally different kind of story altogether, but it is similar in that the Saxon tales are telling the story of King Alfred, but through the eyes of Uhtred, who is a warlord who helps him. This is telling the story of King Arthur through the eyes of you and your friends, who are the knights that are helping. And so you are still there at the heart of the story, especially as we get into the Twilight period. But there's other things going on. And then last of all, of course, is the Twilight period, which ends literally with as many people dying as possible. This is not a campaign about surviving. The King Arthur story is a tragedy, and it does end with the fall of Camelot, and it does end with the giant battle of Camlan, in which virtually everybody dies. But there is going to be, that one player character who is there at the end and who throws the sword into the lake and who helps King Arthur get onto the barge with the ladies of the lake. And if you love Arthurian literature, if you love those stories, then this campaign is a wonderful way to be a part of it, to get to tell your own version of it, to experience those events and be, while maybe not King Arthur himself, still a very important piece of the puzzle that helps everything work. So let's show you a little bit how this is organized because it is done really well and interesting in my opinion. So every period that we've talked about begins the same way. There's some quick notes right here, beeping, and then a little historical comparison because time advances in a very weird way in the King Arthur stories because Uther was very medieval, very, old school. This is the year 485. But then as you're going up, we will jump, for example, to the conquest period, historical comparison. Now we're talking about Henry V for England and Agincourt and those kind of things. The Romance period, well, now this is early 13th century, Richard the Lionheart, that kind of era. Obviously, we're not telling the story of those kings. This is just a historical comparison. And so as you advance through the ages, technology is advancing with you. And while you begin with kind of very basic plate mail, by the end of the Twilight period, you're going to be in full Gothic plate and all of these advances in culture and technology are going to happen very quickly because of the way that the King Arthur story has always been historically told. So, notes, historical comparison, some campaign stuff, and then we get some really valuable setting information. What is Britain like in the year 485? See this little list of places? Well, check this out. There's another long list. That list goes on for several pages, and then there's a map of what the politics look like. Here's the Kingdom of Logres, which is what Uther rules at this point. But there's lots of other big kingdoms, and part of your job during the Uther period is to unite them all under a single banner so that Uther can be the High King. And so much location information. And then we get what is new, what kinds of equipment do you have, Norman armor, you've got, which isn't even really plate, and then some basic history about where you'll be, little maps, and then way more setting information, just more setting, more maps, so that you at the start of this period can know exactly what the world is like and how you can interact with it. Okay, then we get into the years themselves, and this, I'm not going to get all the way into the years themselves first because I want to show you one more thing. Before we drill down into the years, we got to look at the rest of the last thing that each period includes is a bunch of extra adventures. So you go through year by year, and Pendragon is designed so that each play session, or maybe 2 or 3 play sessions in a row, will be a single year. And at the end of that year, there's a winter phase, and things happen, and you control your manor, you get married, you have children, those children grow up, all of these things are going on. And so you're tracking, again, the lifetime, not just of this knight, but of that knight's entire family and their holdings. Interspersed with the rest of the adventures that you will be having year by year, there's a bunch of extra adventures. There is something to do in every year, each of these 82 years of the story, but there's also these other things that you can fit in there, and many of them are very small. Some of them, for example, there's a border challenge. That's the kind of thing that can happen over and over as you are just a brand new knight in 485 or whatever, helping the little region of Salisbury and your Lord Roderick. He might send you out to guard the border and make sure nobody gets in. Or he might send you into enemy lands. And so there's little adventures of how to handle all that stuff. Some of these have a little more flavor to them, like the mercenary Syagrius, which is a specific encounter with a specific person who will become important at some point in the story. So there's all those things. Now let's take a look at the year-by-year adventures. Okay, each of these also starts with the same kind of basic information. It's going to show you what the court is like, who the special guests at that court are going to be, different bits of gossip you can overhear while at court, news you can learn at court, and conversations you can have, intrigue that can happen. The year is kind of bookended to some extent each year by 2 courts. What we're talking about now is the Easter court. Everyone gets together for Easter court, and then at the end of the year is the Christmas court. Sometimes those are royal courts at which Uther himself will be there, or later on Arthur, but for the most part it's just you and your lord in Salisbury, because we start in Salisbury. That's where the story goes. And then there is an event. In the case of year 485, there is a battle of Mirkred Creek down here. This is a little Saxon kingdom, and they're getting uppity, and you need to go stop them. And so you get to have this little battle. Then there's another battle of Colchester, which you don't actually participate in, you just hear about it. And then there's some Christmas court stuff, and then some special modifiers for the winter phase. And that's what every year has. Now, the year 485 is very simple, because ideally, most of what you're going to be doing there as the very first year of the campaign is becoming a knight, and you go through your little trial, and that's all detailed in the main book. Once we get into later things, year 485, there's this whole extra adventure. You are going to go to the Sword Lake. Merlin needs your help. And so it's time to go there, and you have to fight this ugly looking giant thing, and then you get the sword. And that is the year 486. Year 487, you've got the sword, so now you get to take it around and show people. And what is that like? And the map will continue to change as Uther gains power. And so every year there are things to do, there are choices to make, that you can be involved in this storyline or this part of the other storyline. The land will change, the map will change, who is important and who is not will change as Uther or whoever else is in charge starts to gain or lose political power. And you as the characters are there through it for 82 years of incredibly rich and detailed story. I cannot stress too much how wonderful this game is and how fun it is to play through this kind of a storyline. So, great Pendragon campaign. I am not kidding when I say that it is the greatest role-playing campaign ever published. I recommend it very highly if you like medieval role-playing, knights. If you're a fan of Arthur to any degree, pick this up and give it a try, because it is really, really cool and really well done. So, thanks for watching, and I will see you on my next review.